Our last talk of the day is from our own Dan Uden. Dan's an assistant professor here in the School of Natural Resources, split with agronomy. Yep, agronomy and horticulture. So I'll let Dan to it, but I need to share.
And it's the whole screen that's shared, right? Or is it just the presentation?
I think it's the
whole screen.
Don't
Okay.
do presentation because it'll show up over here, this computer.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you, Paul. It's great to be able to share with you today a little bit about an effort that goes back as part of a much broader team that I've been fortunate to be a part of probably for 5 or 6 years now, going back to my postdoc days. And that's around this issue of mapping the spread of trees, woody encroachment, as we often say, in our grasslands. But really, it's much broader than that. I mentioned I'm part of a team here, and you may recognize some of the faces of other members of this team. But it's much broader than development of maps or a tool. This is really an effort to conserve grasslands, to inform decisions, management decisions about those grasslands, develop spatial game plans, we like to say. And so I'm a spatial scientist. I'm more on the, I might call it the research and development side of this effort, development of the tools. And I think a lot about pixels, as in pixels of an image. But it's important to remember that really, I think this development or this work is really about ecosystems, but it's about people too. So I'm going to start out a little bit talking about people, because there'll be plenty of time to talk about pixels. So this is very broadly part of an effort with NRCS Working Lands for Wildlife. Jarak Twidwell is another professor here at the University of Nebraska in agronomy and horticulture, who's serving as a science advisor for the NRCS on a Great Plains grasslands initiative. And that's the context of this work. Now, you see a photo of several of us from this summer at a conference in Manhattan, Kansas. Jarak's not in that picture. We just unfortunately didn't have time to snag him for that. Jarak's in the upper right, who's really kind of the unifying thread there. We all worked in Jarak's lab at one point or another. And so we were all here in Lincoln at one time or another, but I have since moved on to an assistant professor position. Dylan Fogarty, next to me in the photo there, is a research scientist here at the university, does a lot in the realm of research and outreach and extension. Tori Donovan's now an assistant professor at the University of Florida. Sam Cady is a postdoc here at the university. Caleb Roberts is now at the University of Arkansas, assistant unit leader in the Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit there. And Reinhard Schultz is also a postdoc. So a number of us in this photo are more on the, I'll say, the technical side, the research and development side, but the broader efforts, you see Jarak talking to a group of stakeholders about grasslands, about spatial game plans for managing grasslands. Where do we apply management treatments? And Dylan's done a lot of work in that realm as well.
Is the screen not shared?
Nope.
The wrong one.
Yeah,
to
we're
share.
seeing the presenter, but not the screen.
Oh, there.
Now?
No, still the Teams meeting.
Could also just join the screen on join the meeting on my laptop here if that's easier.
We might try that, but let's try.
There it is. Oh, the school natural resource save the dates.
This? Now?
No,
No. Now?
no.
Oh, no. You want me to grab my laptop and just
Yeah.
join the
Right.
teams? Okay.
This worked all day, I don't know why. Makes no sense, it's working here.
Okay, I'm joining the meeting now
Okay.
with my mic muted.
That's it, you're gonna use the room mic?
Yeah, so I guess I'll use the room mic, but I'll just share my slides here.
Yeah.
Okay, let's try this again here. My slides. Let me share my screen. Okay,
Yeah.
how about now, everyone? Are we good?
Yes.
Excellent.
Pregnant pause.
All right, well, apologies for that, but I didn't get too far in. So here is the kind of cover slide. Let me actually do one more thing before let me get my camera off of my machine here so I don't see three of myself up here. Okay. So, thank you. And I just was describing to you this broader team effort with several of us. George mentioned Manhattan, Kansas. This photo was also taken in Manhattan, Kansas. And this is part of a very much broader effort by NRCS Working Lands for Wildlife, which has a number of other partnerships. Direct Twidwell is serving as a science advisor on that effort, as I mentioned. So really the end goal of this work is to develop products that are useful for decision making and useful for helping people collaborate, specifically in the area of grassland management. And just to highlight some of where just recent places that work has been showcased, again, much more in the realm of the folks who are doing more of the outreach and extension, but some of this work was Nebraska-based writer Carson Vaughn had an opinion piece in the New York Times last month that showcased some of these maps and the efforts to use them. Cornell Lab of Ornithology, closer home, Beef Watch here at the university, all around this idea of building collaboration and conservation of grassland cores and sustaining them moving forward. And a little more generally about the importance of the work. We know that our grasslands, our rangelands across the country, and specifically our grasslands here in the Great Plains, are crucial for a number of things. Ecosystem services, from forage for cattle to clean water, clean air, habitat for grassland-dependent species. The list goes on and on. So our grasslands are very important. We're demanding a lot of our grasslands in regard to ecosystem services. Their cultural importance, for example, which I think the group here is well acquainted with as well. The second thing about our grasslands I'll mention is that they're threatened. We're losing grass rapidly. It's one of the most imperiled ecosystems globally, as well as here in the US. We're losing grasslands to the plow. We're losing them to the tree, which is a lot of what my work today will focus on. We're also losing them to the ranchette and the subdevelopment. And so how do we manage in the context of this? How do we move forward? Because grasslands are very managed systems. For as long as there have been grasslands in the Great Plains, there have been people managing them here. And so how do we do that today in light of the large scale changes we're experiencing? Some of the broad motivation of the work. And from the scientific perspective, the realm of theory that I come from, we're interested in the science of early warning. How can we see major changes coming before they hit us? In terms of management, how do we prepare for management? How do we manage ecosystems to preventatively, proactively, instead of reactively? So instead of waiting until we have a problem, when it's much more expensive and less likely that we'll be successful, how do we manage proactively when our costs are low, our returns on our investments are high, and when our ability to collaborate and work together and scale up are greatest? That's really the application of this type of work, but it comes out of a rich body of theory that spans all sorts of different systems. But when we talk about it in the context of changes in land use, one thing we know about the loss of our grasslands or the changes of our grasslands is it's not random. This isn't just, grass isn't just randomly disappearing. Ecosystems aren't just randomly transitioning. There's a lot of order to the processes that are driving these things, and there's good reason for that. So we know that these, we call them regime shifts, where we experience major changes in ecosystems that change the structure of those ecosystems, the functions within them, and we often talk about feedbacks that sustain those systems. We might think of a conversion from grassland, dominated by perennial species, forbs and grasses in the lower part of this photo, to a system that's largely dominated by woody plants. It's an example of a regime shift that exhibits spatial temporal order. To bring in some classic diagrams and kind of give some additional context to this transition, you might think of it with this classic diagram where you have a system that can exist in this basin of attraction, or this trough, or this cup here. And this system is dominated by grassland. And the system is free to move about within its grassland state and vary from year to year based on climate management, all sorts of things. But that system can experience disturbances that push it across thresholds and into alternative states where they kind of get stuck over there. In this case, the alternative state is an ecosystem dominated by woody plants, where you have different structures, different functional groups, different functions, and different feedbacks. And once the system moves over to that state, it can be very difficult to get it back into the original state. Now, the reason that's important is because of all the things we rely on grasslands for. Cattle forage is a good example. Habitat for grassland-dependent species is a good example, and the list goes on and on. So if we value those ecosystem services, we have motivation to keep systems in their desired states before they experience transitions. And this is a common way to represent this type of change in ecology. Now, as I've just described it, and as at least I often think about it, these changes occur over time, right? Which they do. You have a grassland, and then maybe you have trees start growing in that grassland, and over, in this example, maybe a period of 10 to 20 years, that system has moved from a grassland to a woodland. And that does occur, and that's useful to know that and to understand the rates at which that happened, and maybe how those rates differ from place to place. But what would be often more useful, and maybe I'm a little bit biased as a spatial scientist, is if we could map these things. So instead of thinking of these changes as playing out over time, how do they play out over space and in space and time? So if we replace year on the x-axis here with longitude, this would be a one-dimensional representation spatially of that change. Of course, the goal for a map would be to get it to 2 dimensions at least. And so this was the task that I was beginning to grapple with about 5 years ago in my postdoc, is how can we represent these type of changes on landscapes in ways that are useful for managing and useful for proactive management? How can we get early warning of these changes before they occur? And to do that, we really have a rich body of theory guiding us. We have all sorts of new forms of data and technology. George's talk was a great example of that. How do we take what we know about ecosystems and what we understand about them, decades of work by ecologists about how these systems function, how do we leverage cutting edge data and powerful technology to make ourselves useful and to develop tools that are useful for making decisions and collaborating in the space? That's the big challenge and the motivation. I won't linger too long here, just to note that there's a rich body of theory, including at UNL, this idea of regime shifts in systems or state transitions. How does a system flip from one state to another? And what's our potential to anticipate that change? I'll note as well the data piece, and the data that a lot of this work is based on is a relatively new land cover data set called the Rangeland Analysis Platform. And this provides data on plant functional groups for the entire United States in every year for the Landsat record or the recent Landsat missions. And so I'll see what I'm sharing here. If you're interested in following along yourself, you can go to this website at rangelands.app here and launch the RAP platform to give you a better idea of what I'm talking about. So what we have here is data on plant functional groups in grassland areas for every year from 1986 to present. And so if I wanted to see estimates of a perennial foreground grass cover, which you see the Great Plains dominates land cover here in 1986 versus 1998, or if I wanted to look at estimates for tree cover and perhaps how that's changed over time, you can do that with this platform, 1998 to 2022. And so this is really an innovative data product that, as we're setting out on development of this tool, my objective was to analyze the RAP in a way that makes a useful product for talking about where these zones of transition between ecosystems are. Okay, so that's the context of the work and the data. Now, the other, on the technology side, the thing that really helps us out here is geospatial cloud computing. Specifically, Google Earth Engine was very pivotal in this effort, allowing us to access data very easily and analyze it with the power of Silicon Valley instead of just my laptop or even supercomputer down the road. So as we brought these 3 pieces together, we wanted to make sure and acknowledge that, yes, the tools are cool, the data is there, but the power in this approach, and I am convinced what will make it useful as a management tool, is the ecology and the ecological thinking underlying it. And we are not by a long shot the first people to ask these type of questions and to use data to get to analyze and to get answers to these type of questions about how systems are arranged, how ecosystems spatially are arranged. This is just one example. The great ecologist Evelyn Pilu, 60 years ago, over 60 years ago, was writing about this in forests of British Columbia, talking about co-dominant tree species in the forest and saying, well, if we had not just one thing that was dominant, but two things that were co-dominant and were kind of vying for that dominance, how would we represent that spatially? How would we quantify that? And of course, she, as a mathematician, had some great insights into that, where we still use some of her indices today, evenness indices and things related to that, talking about the co-dominance of pieces of ecosystems. Well, what we're doing really is no different, but instead of co-dominant tree species in British Columbia, we're talking about plant functional groups that are competing for co-dominance across our landscapes. Is this going to be a grassland, or is this going to be a woodland, or is this going to be a desert, bare ground? It could be any of these things. We could be in a forest, we could be in a grassland, we could be in a desert. In fact, we've experienced all of those things at some spatial scale in the Great Plains. If you think about the Dust Bowl years, we've had forests covering the continent at various points in time, which Paul could tell us more about than I could. But it's still the same fundamental question, is how are these things arranged spatially in relation to one another, and how does that organization change over time? So to do this, we used an old trick from spatial analysis called a moving window or a sliding window. And to illustrate how that works, I'd like you to pay attention to these 4 boxes on the top of the screen, and in particular, the red outlined area. So this is a randomly selected landscape. I think it's just south of North Platte in Nebraska, where we visually see what's going on in this landscape. We've got grassland here, and then we've got a woodland. And what we're able to do with this data and cloud computing and our guiding theory is to develop a matrix that quantifies how these different plant functional groups are interacting with one another. And what you see, some of these numbers are bigger than others, either in the negative sense or the positive sense. But what I'll note here is the extreme value, the combination between perennials and trees for this specific pixel, where what this is indicating is that perennials and trees are failing to coexist in this space, in this landscape. They're segregating out spatially. They're separating from one another. You could put your foot almost on one foot in the prairie and one foot in the woodland, and you look to your right and you see all trees, and you look to your left and you see all grass. That's what this metric, it's a boundary detection metric. So it's really, technically it's just a spatial variance covariance matrix, but what it's doing is highlighting those areas of contrast between different plant functional groups, in this case perennial and trees. So you see that in our red box you have areas of blue, low contrast, where it's grass dominated, but you also have areas of blue, low contrast, where it's tree dominated. In between them, right on the boundaries, where things get interesting, and what we're doing here is detecting this boundary between a grassland ecosystem and a woodland ecosystem at a very small scale. Now, where the cloud computing comes in is operationalizing this over much broader scales. Again, just a closer view of that, where you see you start in the grassland regime, you cross this transition boundary that lights up with this covariance metric, and you enter the woodland regime. So you're cool, hot, back into cool. So it doesn't really tell you what it's transitioning to, it just tells you that there's a transition happening. Now, what we can do when we scale up this approach is pull in this data at various spatial extents. Here you see the Great Plains region, with this boundary detection employed at a large spatial scale. So every pixel is pulling in information from its surrounding landscape and calculating that degree of contrast between perennials and trees. And what we're generally observing here is a increasing intensification of this perennial tree signal. You'll notice here in Nebraska in 1991, this little glowing yellow spot in the middle of the state, that's Halsey National Forest. So that's what Halsey National Forest looks like at this scale. It remains consistent over time, but you see other areas of the state getting areas of more early warning of woody encroachment occurring. George talked about prescribed fire in the Flint Hills region of eastern Kansas. You see that area as a holdout to this woody transition signal, largely because of all that prescribed fire that's going on and George is detecting in the radar. So nice little connection between our talks there. But so that's the type of scale we're seeing. The Flint Hills is massive if you ever drive through it. But you see it in relation to the calculations we're doing here, which are very large. If we zoom in a little closer to the state of Nebraska at 2 time steps, we can see a little bit more detail in this view. Areas that are not necessarily fully transitioning to trees, but that transition is beginning to happen, that you're starting to see grasses and trees separate out in space. And that contrast itself isn't a bad thing. It's just when it moves over time that we want to pay attention. You know, a wooded riparian area might be just fine, but when you start having the trees march up into the uplands, that's when some ecosystem services like cattle forage and wildlife habitat might be impacted. So we do bring space into these analyses as well, not just looking at this contrast, but how that contrast advances in a spatial order over time. And so lots of potential for multi-scale analysis. Here we have the Great Plains with the Sandhills region outlined, a state view of a similar thing, but with a different scale of the signal. And then UNL's Barter Brothers Ranch here, where I do a lot of research as well. So the scale at which you compute these metrics affects how you kind of see the signal playing out. And our goal is to align that with management objectives. At what scale is this information useful for decision makers? I'll just, as I'm right at the end here, I'll just note a few areas where we're pushing forward on in the science realm on this. I mentioned Caleb Roberts at the outset has found good evidence in multiple ecoregions now that bird communities are responding to this signal. This is prairie chicken leks on Fort Riley, Kansas, where essentially the prairie chickens are avoiding these transition boundaries over time as they as the landscape changes. The birds effectively move further into the cores of grassland, which we would align with our understanding of prairie chicken ecology. And that's just one example. Caleb's doing a lot of work and has students working on this as well. Doing some additional analysis that are in prep, we can calculate these transition signals for individual land parcels, such as all public lands and their surrounding privately owned lands throughout the Great Plains, and look at the changing intensity of the signal over time and at different time scales. Again, a lot of spatial order here. Analysis is in progress, but I'll just end by pulling this back to some of the work by Drac and Dylan. Dylan's got a pocket guide even that's come out on managing woody plant encroachment. It's really a spatial game plan for management. So it's a good translation between these maps and these tools and the management decision. If you were to take this information and go out, how can you most effectively deploy conservation actions to maximize your ability to conserve grasslands based on both the ecology of the species and some of the technology and data we're getting from places like satellites. So I encourage you to, if you're interested in those tools, to look into some of those. I mentioned the Great Plains Grasslands Initiative, the work of Dylan Fogarty and Dirac, and putting some of that science, as well as the science that's continuing to come out from Caleb Roberts and myself and others on the team. So I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks, Dan. Questions for Dan from the group?
I can see chat here too, I believe.
Good. Some applause there. Digitally.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for, I'll type my email here in the chat. If anyone has any additional questions. Okay, well, at that point, I'll stop sharing here.
Okay. We're back. All right, folks, that rounds out our set of talks for the afternoon and really rounds out our meeting. So I'll open up the floor to anyone if they have questions or comments. Again, we're one goal that we have is to try to improve our offering here and aid our partners as best we can. And so if you have input or comments on how this is going and what you'd like to see in the future, this would be a great time to discuss, or you can send us an email and let us know via that route.
Hey, Paul, this is Tom. I'll just say it was great to hear these example projects. Really awesome work, you guys. And it was very nice to have the student award and a student awardee presentation. I really appreciate hearing that too. So kudos to you all for putting together a nice meeting.
Thanks. I liked how some of our talks kind of joined up in kind of a strange way. Kind of unintentional, I guess. Yeah, I'd like to say that was completely planned, but it was not. So it was kind of cool. All right. Well, I appreciate you guys showing up. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and we will see you next time.
Don't forget to tell them about presentations.
Yeah, we'll put the presentations up online too on our website. So, and we'll send a link around with that. So thank you very much.